Okay, so I just wanted to wrap up this longish lecture with a few slides to kind of make clear what the overall point of this sampling process is for our purposes as social scientists or linguists or what have you. And so for that, I want to kind of start by going back to this basic distinction we've drawn between populations and samples. So these are two distinct but related sets of statistical entities, I'm calling them. But on the one hand, we have populations, which are basically the entire collection of individuals in some group that we're interested in the world. So again, this could be like every single speaker of English in the world or every single speaker of Malayalam or whatever. And then when we look at sort of the properties of individuals in this group, we can calculate parameters like means or standard deviations. Say if we're talking about, for whatever reason, the height of every single English speaker in the world. It might not be that interesting to study, but we could study it and actually come up with a specific value for the mean height of all those speakers of English. And if we did that for the entire population, then we'd represent that mean with the Greek letter mu, because it's something sort of, official, I guess, and the standard deviation would be represented with the Greek letter sigma. And we can contrast that with samples, from which we can derive statistics. So a sample is just a subset of a population, and this is something we would normally study when we run an experiment of some sort, because we don't have the resources normally to study an entire population of a language or whatever we might be interested in as linguists. And when we do calculate sort of meaningful quantitative values from a sample of a population, those features are called statistics, and they're represented with different sort of variables that are not Greek letters, they're Roman letters. So the mean in that case would be x bar, the standard deviation would be s, so on and so forth. I've said this many times over at this point, so hopefully the distinction is clear, but if it's not, you can always review multiple times what this is about, I guess. So we have populations on one hand, samples on the other. Those are sort of the groups we're looking at, but then what we kind of wind up calculating in running an experiment and doing quantitative analysis on it is statistics, and from those statistics we're hoping to find out something about the parameters of a population. So we've also learned through our brief sampling demo in the first part of this lecture that we can add a third entity to the mix of this sort of distinction. And once we get to the third part, things get a little more complicated, but also more interesting. So the third entity is what I'm going to call sampling distributions. And in a sampling distribution, the individuals are the statistics of samples. And again, I kind of tripped over that when I was saying it, so I'll say it again. The individuals are the statistics of samples. A lot of S's in there. I don't know if I can get through them all. But this is weird. So this is like that demo where we, took multiple samples from a population, and for each sample we calculated the mean of that sample, and we did that multiple times and eventually just plotted the distribution of the means of the samples. That distribution is a sampling distribution. And so I have this point here that this is a little bit weird and it's kind of meta. So like normally you can think pretty easily of like, well, let's calculate the average F0 for every single student in this class. And we just grab the sample of like 12 people in this class. And we could maybe compare that to like all the people in the history of the world who have taken this class, if that's the population, to figure out what that, population parameter is. But we're doing things a little bit differently here. We're taking different samples at random, ideally, and calculating their means, and then plotting a distribution of that information. So it's not really something you could directly, apprehend in one particular group of people. You have to do it over kind of abstracting over a variety of different groups of people, which all have sort of the same underlying property. And it's like, why would we do something that kind of meta? Why are we looking at the distributions of statistics of samples instead of just samples themselves? So the reason why is we're looking at just the sample statistics whenever we run an experiment. But what we really want to know about are the population parameters, or often it's the case that we want to draw conclusions about the population and its parameters. And the way we're going to do that is through this sort of conduit of sampling distributions. So in order to go from what we can observe directly in a sample to knowledge about a population, which we don't have the resources to observe in its entirety, we have to make inferences about the population parameters from the sample statistics. So that's kind of the important point here. And in a sense, it might be easier to understand if I draw an analogy with phonetics and phonology. So this is kind of like parallel to the phoneme and phone split in phonetics and phonology. So what you get when you're listening to somebody speak is that you can only see or hear the phones, what's on the surface in the transcription of what they said. But what you really want to know about are the phonemes, sort of the structure that underlies the surface details that you get phonetically. And as linguists, we've kind of learned how to do this over time, or maybe have some sort of natural proclivity for jumping to conclusions that you need to figure out what's happening, pattern-wise in sound and language. But how we do that in phonology, it's ultimately kind of a little bit of a mystery. Something that human beings are really good at doing is, generalizing across or finding patterns across, surface details in data or experiences, I guess. And what we're actually doing when we figure out, that the vowel is voiceless in Mocalese when it's between two voiceless segments, that's not all that easy to kind of figure out how we do that. Or sort of rationalize step by step what's going on there. And that is the case whether we're a linguist trying to analyze language from sort of the outside, or just looking at this, sound level data, or if we're an infant, jumping to those conclusions or generalizing across the individual experiences we have to learn the language. There's similar things that linguists and infants do there, but there's also different things they do there, but there's also not really clarity in terms of what is going on. That's why we have, people studying language acquisition. And nobody's, I think, studying linguistics as sort of like a phenomenon in itself. There's no science. There's no meta science of linguistics. But there could be, I guess, but it would be even harder to get grant money for that, I think, than it is to do it in linguistics. But what we're going to do in stats is different. So statisticians are more conservative than both babies and linguists, it turns out, and which is, again, good science. You don't want to make your conclusions too liberal or too broad if you don't have to, and if definitely you shouldn't, because you just want to be able to state what you know. So what we do in stats is base our inferences about the unseen level of structure, the population level, on known relationships between the distribution of sampling statistics and the population parameters. So to kind of review this, because it can easily get confusing, but we're going to make inferences. We'll skip all this linguistic stuff for the moment. We're going to make inferences about the population from the sample here. And the way we do that is we base those inferences on what we know about the connection between the distribution of sampling statistics and the population parameters. So there's a relationship there which we have to make clear, which will make this process sort of both explicit and reasonably conservative. Like I said, we're going to wind up stating essentially what we know without jumping to too many unjustified conclusions. At least that's the ideal. So the process of making these inferences is therefore pretty mechanical, and anyone can do it. You don't have to have the magical intellectual properties of a linguist, or maybe, we all know human babies are special, and they have this special ability to figure out what's going on in the language around them. And we don't know exactly how that works, but it doesn't matter for stats, because we're going to do something just pretty much straightforward and, like I said, mechanical, or maybe even algorithmic, I guess. But to do that, we need to know what relationship exists between the population distributions and the distributions of sampling statistics. So what is that relationship? We're going to talk about it in terms of this theorem called the central limit theorem, which has a lot of important things to say about how the world of statistics works. And it primarily has three different sort of axioms, I guess you would say, which we can use to sort of make this leap from what we can observe to what we can't observe, but what we want to know about. Okay, so sorry, it's another hot one here today in Calgary, Alberta. I'll take a drink of water. Thermometer says 26.4 Celsius. All right, so the central limit theorem describes the properties of the relationship between the distribution of sampling statistics and the populations from which they are drawn. So the first property, not axiom, but property, is that as the number of individuals selected in a series of samples increases, the distribution of the means of those samples will approach normality. So this is the kind of crucial feature here to begin with, is the number of individuals in your sample. So this is again, we're going to take multiple samples from the same population, and in one sort of approach we could take like just 5 individuals in each sample, and then in another we could take like maybe 25, and then maybe another we got to take 125, for instance. But in each group we're just doing the same number of individuals in each sample multiple times. So like 20 samples of 5 individuals each, or then maybe 20 samples of 25 individuals each, so on and so forth. And simply by changing the number of individuals in each sample, the distribution of the means of those samples will start to approach normality. And this will happen even if the population distribution itself is not normal. And this is kind of the point of what the original little demo was of sampling. If I go back in the slides to this sort of shape-shifting example with F0. So the original F0 distribution is not normal. It's skewed here over to the right, and it kind of has a little bit of normality here on the left, but overall the whole thing is not what you would call normal. But when we start to plot a sampling distribution from the means of the samples taken from this underlying F0 distribution, we start to get something that looks a lot more normal, especially as we kind of increase the number of the items in each sample and do it many, many times over. So that's why that happens. That's a prediction of the central limit theorem. And conveniently, it turns out to be true. So let's try to trust this principle and see where else it can take us. And where else it can take us is property number 2. So property number 2 is the mean of the sampling distribution will be equal to the population mean. And we basically found out that we were getting that sort of result when we looked at the sampling demo earlier with the F0 data as well. It doesn't wind up being exact, so the mean of the sampling distribution is pretty much in the neighborhood of the population mean itself, but because there's a bit of randomness in terms of like how we're taking samples from the population, we don't get the exact same number every single time, right? It just gets closer the more sampling we do and the more items we have in each sample. And this is important because we know a little bit about normal distributions by now. And this first point is kind of referring back to property number 1. It's nice to be able to work with normal distributions because we can calculate things like z-scores and whatnot in them. Also, we know that the mean of any individual sample will almost certainly not be exactly equal to the population mean, but we would like to know what that population mean is in a lot of cases. Again, not so much in linguistics, but in general research, it's something that happens quite a bit where you want to be able to draw conclusions about sort of the properties of the population or the parameters of the population, I guess you could say. I guess you should say. And then lastly, this maybe is not quite as neat and tidy as some of the first 2 properties of the central limit theorem, but the prediction for the standard deviation of the distribution of sampling means will be that that standard deviation will be the same as the population standard deviation divided by square root of n. So this is representing this fact using the sort of Greek letter terminology. So when I have sigma here, that represents the population standard deviation, and then n is just the number of items in a sample. And we'll see where this takes us next time, but basically the overall thrust of this property is that we're going to get a normally distributed sampling distribution when we do a lot of sampling. And then interestingly enough, the standard deviation of that normal distribution, the standard deviation of that sampling distribution is going to be basically smaller. It's going to make the whole distribution narrower in terms of its spread than what we see in the population distribution itself. And it's the extent to which it becomes narrower depends on how many items you put in each sample. Generally speaking, before I go to that last point, I would say when you get more items in your sample, when you get more participants in your experiment, it has the benefit of making the statistical conclusions you can draw from that data stronger or more robust. It makes it easier to sort of jump to conclusions about the population, the more individuals you can study. So you kind of have to balance that sort of general mathematical fact with the sort of logistics or economics fact about how many resources do you have to sort of devote to studying a lot of different speakers or data points or whatever you're doing for your research, right? But generally speaking, more items will help you out at the end of your experiment when you start running the stats. we'll keep that in mind. We don't know how to jump to conclusions yet, though. We don't know how to draw those inferences yet. So next time we'll talk about how to do that by looking at the mechanics of using these three properties of sampling distributions to help us make those inferences about a population from sample statistics. But for now, these are the basics of how sampling works. So that's all I'm going to say about it for now. I'll see you next time, though, to start talking about testing hypotheses. See you then.